I will comment the paragraph 86 of the Encyclopedia der philosophischen Wissenschaften in the doctrine of being, die Lehre von Sein, Qualität, and the two Zusätze, Zusatz 1, Zusatz 2. I will read the important passages in German, but then I will translate with my limited knowledge of English, because there are some concepts, some determinations which need to be expressed in German because the translation is not adequate in any other language. And I will put a link in the description below to 2 channels. There are probably many more on YouTube, which might enable you to learn or remember or improve your German language if you are interested. So yeah. Also, you can check my playlist, Die Wissenschaft der Logik. Yeah. So, paragraph 86 of the Encyclopedia der philosophischen Wissenschaften. This is what is called as the shorter logic. There is die Wissenschaft der Logik, which is the greater logic, and the logic within the Encyclopedia, which is sometimes called the shorter logic. Here, this is the shorter logic. Sein. The question is, what is being? Das reine Sein macht den Anfang, weil es sowohl reiner Gedanke als das Unbestimmte, Einfache, Unmittelbare ist, der erste Anfang aber nichts Vermitteltes und weiter Bestimmtes sein kann, which in English means being, pure being, is the beginning of what? Of logic and of ontology. Hegel's logic is onto-theo-logical. Onto means being. That's a Greek word which means being, the determinations of being. Theo comes from Greek, means God, and logic means speech, rational discourse, and eventually logic, rationality. So Hegel's logic, the science of logic, is logic about being, God, and logic itself. So what is at the beginning? And here I have to comment, the beginning is not chronological. It's not a temporal beginning. It can be, but there is no time yet. The space, time, the physical world, chronology do not yet exist from a logical standpoint, because there is pure being. So it's a beginning from a methodological and logical standpoint, but I'm not sure that it can be said that it's the chronological beginning, but that's still doubtful, but yeah. So pure being constitutes the beginning of the science of logic, because it is pure thought, and the undetermined, das Unbestimmte, there is no determination. We will see later what a determination is, but vocabulary, terminology to express what a determination is: characteristic, property, quality, feature, determination. So in pure being, there is no determination yet. There is just pure being. Einfache, unmittelbare ist, so it's pure immediacy. Mediation means something is set, posited by something else. It comes out of something else. It is the mediation, the moment, the separation from something else. But here there is no mediation. It's purely immediate. In ordinary consciousness, in the realm of ordinary consciousness, if I look at this book, I see the book immediately, in the sense that between my vision and the book there is a distance, there is light being reflected, etc., etc. But I have an immediate view of the book. if I look at a picture of the book on the internet, my vision of the book is mediated by the computer screen and the internet and the photography and so on and so forth. That's an illustration. What is immediate is what is there, present. But here we are not in the realm of sensuous perception. We're in the realm of pure thought. So pure being is the beginning, and it's undetermined. There's no determination, and it's immediate. And because of these reasons, it cannot be mediated and further determined. There can be no determination. Then, in the development of the paragraph, Hegel says, or the logic says, Sein kann bestimmt werden als ich equals ich, which in English would be I equals I. I equals I. I is I. But equals is not yet is, but I, self, me, not the psychological, empirical me, the thought of self-consciousness. But I, we will see later, eventually when we say I, we mean self-consciousness. I will develop on this point later. But so he says, Sein kann bestimmt werden als ich equals ich. Als die absolute Indifferenz oder Identität, so as the absolute indifference, there's no difference between subject and object, it's just I, or identity, the identity of I, self, with self. I equals I, ich equals ich. Im Bedürfnisse entweder mit einem schlechten Gewissen, so we can begin with a certainty, der Gewissheit seiner selbst, the certainty of oneself, and every self is certain of himself. And the very young children and the very old mentally degenerate people and the mentally degenerate intellectually, they have no sense of self. That's what they cannot speak. They cannot say I. They have lost or not yet acquired the capacity of thinking of themselves as a self. And animals, some people say they have a consciousness in the sense that they have memories, feelings, a certain sense of intelligence in a way they can learn. Some animals can speak, like parrots. They can numerate numbers. Monkeys can do relatively complex intellectual tasks, but no animal other than the human animal can say I, self, me. That's a human specificity. So we could begin with the certainty of self, I equals I am. Oder mit einer Definition oder Anschauung des absoluten Wahren anzufangen, or with a definition or an intuition of what is absolutely true. These could be considered as the first certainty, because Hegel, or logic actually, is trying to find the foundation of knowledge, of certainty, of science. And science is what is true, what is certain, what cannot be doubted. And with what should we begin science? The Anglo-Saxon would say empiricism, experience, verification, observation. Yeah, but observe what? An object. What is an object? Are you sure that the object that you observe is real? What is real? And in order to experience something in a laboratory, chemicals, or to observe the sky, there has to be an observer. A rock cannot make scientific experiments because a rock has no consciousness. But in order for science to be produced, there has to be a scientist. And that's a question that today's theoretical physicists have not yet answered. How does consciousness emerge from the universe? That's a question. The physicists, the most intelligent people with IQs of 160, 70, 180, with very intelligent, educated people with doctorate in quantum theoretical physics or whatever, they still ask themselves the question of consciousness. How does consciousness emerge? But the question is, would there be a physical world and theoretical physics and physicists if there was no consciousness? That's the question between realism, materialism, and idealism. And the science of logic says we should, or maybe we could, begin science, which must be ultimately true, certain, absolute, with the certainty of self. But Hegel says later that it's already too determined. Aber innerhalb jeder dieser Formen, the definition of what is absolutely true, the intellectual intuition, the certainty of oneself, bereits Vermittlung ist, so sind sie nicht wahrhaft die Ersten. So there is a mediation in this certainty. When I say I equals I am myself, self-consciousness. I am myself, and I am certain that I am through the mediation of myself, so to speak. So it's already too determined because there is a self, there is an I, in the sense that I am. So that's already, we can doubt, maybe I am not, I don't know. And Fichte, the German philosopher, tried to set the foundations of die Wissenschaftslehre, the doctrine of science, to found absolute certainty upon he begins, I think, with A equals A, that's absolute certainty. A is equal to itself, and then he says I, das Ich, the absolute ego, it's the absolute certainty. And Descartes, the foundational moment of modern philosophy is the Cartesian moment, when Descartes, that's the official story, can be doubted and should be doubted. That's a Cartesian piece of advice. But the story of Descartes is he was educated in one of the best schools of Europe in his days, early 17th century, and he discovered in his youth, in his adult life, that all the knowledge that he had gathered was doubtful and dubious sometimes, and he was not satisfied with everything he had been taught about rhetoric, grammar, logic, scholastic logic, poetry, the study of the ancients. He found contradictions or reasons to doubt or to question, and he wanted to shake things up in a philosophical standpoint and to re-establish, or rather to establish, a certainty for knowledge. And that's the story that we find in Le Discours de la Méthode, the Discourse on Method, and the Metaphysical Meditations. Descartes was a radical epistemologist, one could say, and he decided to doubt everything until he stumbled upon something which could not be doubted. And the Cartesian moment in the history of philosophy and the Cartesian process is to doubt everything. And his radical doubt is radical methodical skepticism. He doesn't doubt for the sake of doubting, but in order to, skepticism is a moment of the establishment of knowledge. Descartes chose to doubt in order, he hoped, that he would be able to found, in the sense of foundation, certain knowledge. So skepticism and doubt was used consciously by Descartes in order to establish science eventually. And he doubted everything. He said, I can doubt the existence of the world because maybe, in his view, there is an evil genius, a malevolent magician who deceives me and wants to make me believe that there is a world, whereas actually there is no world. I can doubt this. The magician would have to be very smart, very powerful, but maybe a magician is deceiving me. he says, maybe I have no body. Maybe I am, that's not the word I use, but maybe I am hallucinating my body. Maybe my body is a delusion because I, and that's the principle of I, the self can extract itself out of the brain and the body eventually, and that's why we say my body. But whose body is it? When I say my body, it means that there is a self which identifies the body as his own. But with the fact that we say I have a body means that I is different from the body, that the body is a possession of the I. But who is the I? What is the I? That's the self, that's thought. And Descartes says, I can doubt in the most radical form everything except the fact that I am doubting. I cannot doubt that I am doubting. My doubt, paradoxically, and one could say dialectically maybe, that doubt is a certainty. Hegel was smart. I give him credit for that. He was smart. Yeah, so doubt cannot be doubted. That's the Cartesian view. So I have the certainty that I doubt, and when I doubt, there is I. So I am, I think. Because to doubt is to think. Doubting is a thought. So I am, I think. The official motto is Je pense donc je suis, I think therefore I am. But in his later meditations, Descartes says, I think I am. He takes away the logical connection. I think I am. And when I say I think I am, that's the identity of thought and being. It is through thinking that we are. And the identity of thought and being is at the root, at the beginning of the science of logic. So, yeah. Die Vermittlung ist ein Hinausgegangensein aus einem ersten zu einem zweiten und Hervorgehen aus unterschiedenen. Here, that's a little bit complicated, so I need a translation. But I get the broad idea, but I don't want to. Yeah. So, mediation. Mediation. Okay. In these thoughts, there is mediation, so they are not really the first, and mediation consists in having got of a first term. Die Vermittlung ist ein Hinausgegangensein, to have been gone out of something, of immediacy, to go to a second, so aus einem ersten zu einem zweiten, so hinausgehen, to go out from the first to the second, that is mediation. And und hervorgehen aus unterschiedenen, to come from differentiated terms. What is mediated is what comes from an other. And because of these reasons, Hegel says that to begin the science, like Fichte or Descartes did, and Kant to a certain extent, but Kant was kind of different, but Descartes, Kant, and Fichte, although they are different, because there are no two philosophers who are alike, they are identical in their difference, because I'm starting to think and talk like Hegel. Yeah, but there is the continuity between Kant, Descartes, Kant, Fichte. The idea is the self. I think I am for Descartes, the transcendental ego for Kant, Ich, that's absolute ego for Fichte. And Hegel says that's already a mediation, we should go even further back into abstraction and begin with pure being. In pure being, there is no subject, there is no I, no self, no consciousness, just pure being. Wird Sein als Prädikat des Absoluten ausgesagt, so gibt dies die erste Definition desselben. Das Absolute ist das Sein. So if we give being, pure being, as a predicate to the Absolute, then we have the first definition of the Absolute. What is the Absolute? In this case, in the form of a definition, the Absolute is being. But Hegel would say the form of a proposition or a judgment is inadequate to express the truth because there is a distinction between the subject and the predicate, so it's not adequate. So when we say here that Hegel becoming kind of insane, that to say das Absolut ist das Sein, the Absolute is being, if you say that to the ordinary person in the streets, he says, yeah. And Hegel says, so he thinks that's way too abstract, but Hegel says that's already too concrete. We have to go further into abstraction, which is pure being. Okay. I need to calm down and think. Es ist dies die im Gedanken schlechthin anfängliche, abstrakteste und dürftigste. So this view of the Absolute as being, pure being, is the most abstract, the beginning, the initial, and the most poor, the poorest, the most lacking in a way. To say that the Absolute is being, it's very poor. And one could say God is being. That's very poor to say that God is being. Okay. And at the very beginning, it took me quite a lot of time to understand this, but being, pure being, and thought, pure thought, because pure being is a thought. It's pure thought. Being and thought in pure being are not differentiated yet. The difference only comes in the process of the unfolding and the development. That's why it's onto-theo-logical, being, God and logic. Sie ist die Definition der Eleaten, aber zugleich auch das Bekannte, dass Gott der Inbegriff aller Realitäten ist. So this definition of the Absolute as being is the definition of the Eleaten. These are, in the story of philosophy, the Greek thinkers of the school of Parmenides. Parmenides was the Greek thinker who said, being is, non-being is not. And for Hegel, this is the beginning, chronologically, of the history of philosophy, the first real thought, although it's not real in the sense that reality is Dasein mit negation, so, but it's the first true thought, and this is the beginning of the philosophy of Western philosophy, but of philosophy at large. It's to say being is, non-being is not. That's a certainty. And he says that Gott als Inbegriff aller Realitäten, so one metaphysical definition of God is that God is the Inbegriff, means inclusive concept. Begriff is concept. In means within, so it would be the concept which includes, or the including concept of all realities. That's a metaphysical definition of God. God is the concept which includes all realities within himself. Yeah. Okay, so that's what I could say about the paragraph 86, and now I will comment what I have written before going into the Zusätze. I already talked about self-consciousness, I as a certainty, the foundation of science, Kant, Descartes, Kant, Fichte, and when we say I, that's the entire problem of philosophy. When philosophers say I, ich, the self, they do not mean the psychological, empirical, historical self. They do not care about memories, character, personality. That's why Fichte made this intelligible in his popular writings. The I, the self, which speaks, which talks, which thinks in a philosophical work, is not the empirical, psychological, historical self of the author. It is the self of the reader, or it should be. When Kant, in Die Kritik der reinen Vernunft, the critic of pure reason, when Kant talks about the transcendental ego, he's not talking about the mind of Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher of the 18th century. He's talking about everyone's transcendental ego. So potentially every thinking being, human, he says that that's a human mind in his view. Maybe there are non-human thinking entities. But he says every human, every thinking human consciousness, if this view of the transcendental ego with the table of categories, the table of judgments is true, every self should be able to recognize itself in this transcendental ego. And Hegel, that's the ambiguity. Hegel here in this view is not the historical man Hegel. Hegel is the moment of the refutation of Kant, which is not the historical man Kant, but it's the self refuting itself. But let's use the word Hegel for now. Hegel disagreed with the view of Kant's transcendental ego. He says, your table of category is not complete. It's not deduced. You do not deduce the categories from one another. There is no logical connection. You begin with quantity. Why? You should begin with quality. There are missing moments. Why do you draw the categories out of the judgments? The judgment should be derived from the categories. The categories should be derived from pure thought and pure being. So Hegel is very critical of Kant. And here we enter the depth, maybe, of the German mind, which is not really German, it's more than German, but to criticize Kant, Immanuel Kant, for a lack of method, a lack of systematicity, a lack of logic, a lack of intellectual rigor. Only Hegel could do this. Because Kant is a rational, structured, order, methodical thinker, but for Hegel, he's not methodical enough. There's not enough order, not enough logic, not enough deduction. So here we are in the realm of pure philosophy, I would say. So I, the self, me, not the empirical, psychological, historical me with my memories, my character, my personality, but me, I, the self as a thought. When I say I think. But what is I? What am I? What is thought? Here, Kant says the I, the self, what he calls the transcendental ego, is the table of judgments and the table of categories. I made videos in my playlist, the Wissenschaften der Logik, about this. So for Kant, the transcendental self, the transcendental ego, is the table of judgment and the table of categories. Fichte For him, the I, das Ich in German, the self maybe, must be the deduction of itself. The categories, the determinations, Bestimmtheit, Bestimmung, with which we think, must be deduced out of the idea, the thought of the self. And Hegel praised Fichte for having understood that the beginning of science and the completion of science requires the deduction of the categories, not to borrow the categories from classical logic to derive them from judgments, but to derive them from themselves, from the pure thought of self. And Hegel did this methodically, systematically, thoroughly, one might say. And Hegel says thought and being, what is thought, what is being, a process of determination. And to say what is thought, what is being, one has to read Die Wissenschaft der Logik. Yeah, that's what I could say about this paragraph. Okay, now I will comment the first Zusatz, which is the addition, the enlightening explanation, one could say. Wir haben, wenn angefangen wird zu denken, nichts als den Gedanken in seiner reinen Bestimmungslosigkeit, denn zur Bestimmung gehört schon eines und ein anderes. So, in the beginning, which is not chronological, it's ontological and logical, there is nothing as thought but the absence of determination, Bestimmungslosigkeit, the absence of any determination. Because when we have a determination, eine Bestimmung, determination means, in a way, here it's not rigorous, but it means one and the other. A determinate being is, because of his determination, his limitation, his finite aspect, in relation to another. Dasein, Anderssein, being there, determinate being, and an other. When you have a determination, you are determined, so you are in relation to another. But here, pure being, pure thought, is not determined because it is not in relation with another, it's relation to itself, so to speak. But here's the subtlety, the complexity, the exhausting aspect of logic is that Bestimmungslosigkeit, the absence of any determination, is in a way a determination. When you say that something is undetermined, indeterminate, has no determination, you are always determining something. This absence of determination is determined in relation to what is determined. When you say, I don't know this, you don't know this, but you know that you don't know. So you already can know this. You can predicate determinations to this. This is what I don't know. What can you say about what you don't know? I can tell you that I don't know what I don't know. I am sure that I don't know what I don't know. So I know something about what I don't know. I know that I don't know. It seems dumb, useless, stupid, but to be serious, it's fundamental. Yeah. Das Bestimmungslose, wie wir es hier haben, ist das Unmittelbare, nicht die vermittelte Bestimmungslosigkeit, nicht die Aufhebung aller Bestimmtheit, sondern die Unmittelbarkeit der Bestimmungslosigkeit, die Bestimmungslosigkeit von aller Bestimmtheit, das Bestimmungslose als allererstes. The absence of determination that we have here is the immediate, das Unmittelbare. not the mediated absence of determination, not the Aufhebung. Aufhebung cannot be translated. It's preserve, negate, it's Aufhebung. Like Dasein, there are words, that's why I'm speaking German, because there are words that are just German. Aufhebung, Dasein, Bestimmtheit, Bestimmung, it's better in German. So it's not the Aufhebung, the negation and preservation of all determinacies, nicht die Aufhebung aller Bestimmtheit, but the immediacy of the absence of determination. The absence of determination of all determinacies. The absence of determination as the real first, the all and first, allererstes. But this, what I've just said, absence of determination, immediacy, void, no determinations, that's what we call being. We have a name for this Unmittelbarkeit der Bestimmungslosigkeit. That's Sein, that's being. And what could say, if I wanted to be annoying, I would say that being, the thought of pure being, is mediated by this individual with a brain thinking about pure being. So pure being is a thought mediated by a brain thinking the thought. So it's not really pure being. Yeah. So the absence of any determination is what we call being. Dieses ist nicht zu empfinden, nicht anzuschauen und nicht vorzustellen, sondern es ist der reine Gedanke und als solcher macht es den Anfang. So this, pure being. In pure being there is nothing to perceive, to sense, nothing to have the intuition, there is no intuition to have, nothing to be represented, there is no representation, one cannot have any representation of pure being. Pure being would be blank, white space. But space is a determination, and white is a determination. These are physical determinations. So the closest thing that we could have to represent ourselves, pure being, would be blank, white, void, empty space. But this is precisely a picture, a representation, so it's not pure being. So it is rather pure thought, reiner Gedanke, and as such it constitutes the beginning. Okay. So I wrote the indeterminacy, Bestimmungslosigkeit, the absence of any determination, of any determinacy, is being. Nothing to see, nothing to represent, nothing to have any intuition whatsoever. And here we already have the logical passage, if you can speak of a passage from being to nothing, is that because there is nothing in being, being is nothing. I will make a second video, but you already get the idea, so to speak. Okay, then Hegel says, I read the Zusatz. The distinguish or distinct, verschiedenen, degrees, modes, moments, stages, steps, whatever, of the logical idea, we find them in the story and the history of philosophy, in the state or the figure of the various succeeding and following philosophical systems. That's a Hegelian idea that the history of philosophy itself is philosophical, it's logical. Because each has a particular definition of the absolute as its Grundlage, fundamental principle, so to speak. And I talked before as Parmenides, in the view of Hegel, Parmenides, by saying being is, non-being is not, is the logical and chronological beginning of the history of philosophy. That's the first thought about God or being or the absolute, namely, being is, non-being is not. But Hegel would show that there is a problem with this definition. But anyway. So the development, the process of the logical idea is a movement forward, ein Fortgang, a progression, from abstract to concrete. Abstract is absence of determination or lack of determination. Then there's the negation, which is the opposition, the difference, the negative. And then the unity of abstract and negation is what Hegel calls concrete. And the Latin word, which gave the German, English, and French language, and probably many other European languages, the word concrete means, I think, it comes from cum or cum crescere, I think, which means to grow with. The etymological root of the word concrete, concretus in Latin, I think, is the idea of growing with, growing together. So the history of philosophy for Hegel and the logical development of what he calls the idea goes from abstract to concrete. That's a growing, a development. Yeah. So he says that in the history of philosophy, the earliest systems are the most abstract and at the same time the poorest. And here I'll talk briefly about Heidegger, Martin Heidegger. He said, we forgot being. Metaphysics, Western metaphysics, is the forgetfulness of being, as he says. But there is nothing to forget about being, because there is nothing to remember about being, because being is nothing. So, if I could speak to Martin Heidegger, I would say that, what do you want to say about being? There is nothing to say about being, because being is the absence of any determination. So, a speech about being would be very boring, because there is nothing to say about being. Although now I've been talking about being for 42 minutes, but pure being is unspeakable. Yeah, only determinate being can be expressed and talked about. So yeah. The relationship, Verhältnis. In German there is Beziehung, which is relation, and Verhältnis, which is relationship. But the English language is not adequate. So Verhältnis. The Verhältnis, the relationship, from the earlier to the later philosophical system is the same in general as the relationship of the earlier and later degrees, modes, stages of the logical idea. Because the later contain the earlier as aufgehoben, as suppressed and preserved, because every philosophical system in the view of Hegel contains within itself the preceding system as a negative moment of itself. Every philosopher does philosophy to negate or to confirm a predecessor, but they add something. They negate or they add, so they change. And change partly contains negation. So even if you approve a system, you are changing the system by adding your approval to the system of philosophy. So yeah. So that's the meaning of the often misunderstood contradiction in the history of philosophy, the idea that every philosophical system contradicts another, and by negating, contradicting, trying to refute one system, the next fulfills, completes, makes more concrete the absence of determination or the lack or the void of the previous. That's the history of thought. It's true in philosophy, but it's true in every intellectual endeavor. Every scientist in the realm of physics builds his own view of physics upon the errors or the truths of his predecessors. And it is said that Einstein completed Newton. Newton was lacking, and Newtonian physics gave birth to the development of all physics, chemistry, and other, but mostly physics and chemistry. And Einstein saw that there were contradictions with the notion of time, space, and in the electromagnetic field, and he tried to correct Newton. But without Newton, without Newton's errors, so to speak, there would be no Einstein. And without the incomplete aspect of Einsteinian physics, there would be no theoretical physicists today. They are still trying to complete by unifying relativity and quantum physics. So they are still working in a way. And they build their own new system upon either the errors or the lack of the predecessors. That's true in every intellectual endeavor. So he says that when we consider the contradiction of the various philosophical systems, it means that a negated philosophy is not valid anymore. So in the view of Hegel, there's no point in trying to go back to Parmenides or Plato or Aristotle or even Descartes, because philosophy has evolved ever since, has grown. So he says every system has been refuted, but at the same time, because every system contains a moment of the truth, no system has ever been refuted. That's very smart. And that's why one always has to go back to the beginning, to Parmenides. Because to try to refute Parmenides is difficult. It's not impossible, but it's difficult. Being is. Yeah. A Buddhist could refute Parmenides because the Buddhists say nothing, just nothing. And I will talk about nothing later, but the only refutation of Parmenides is Buddhism. And the Buddha, historically, was born broadly at the same era as Parmenides. So on the one hand, you had a Greek saying being is, non-being is not, and there was an Indian, I guess, saying nothing, just nothing. But then Hegel shows that being and nothing are identical. So the Buddha and Parmenides said the same thing. Which was not a thing, because in being there is no thing, and in nothing there is nothing either. That's the inadequacy of language, I guess. So yeah, he said that every philosophical system has been refuted, but every philosophical system has been proven also. That's, both aspects are true. So, yeah. Every philosophy which deserves the name of philosophy has the idea, in general, as a content, and such a philosophical system is a presentation, a Darstellung, of a particular moment or a particular degree, stage in the development process, Entwicklungsprozess of the idea. So every philosophy which deserves to be called philosophy represent a moment, a logical and chronological moment in the unfolding, the development, the becoming concrete of the previous systems. And my idea, which is, I think it's not really my idea, is simply that Hegel's shenanigans Hegel's medicine or recipe should be applied to Hegel himself. And for me, maybe that's why I have no philosophical education as an empirical individual. Maybe that's because I'm dumb as an empirical individual. But when I discovered Hegel, and Hegel says every philosophical system is a moment in the history of philosophy, I said to myself, but there have been philosophical systems, or lack thereof, because the post-Hegelian philosophers are non-systematic, most of them, but they are philosophical and philosophers nonetheless. So my idea was, but if Hegel is right, then the post-Hegelian philosophers are moments in the development of the history of philosophy, so they must be included within the logical process itself. That's why maybe Hegel, the philosophy of Hegel, the empirical system of early 19th century, has to be completed by incorporating Schopenhauer, the late Schelling, Feuerbach, Marx, Comte, Nietzsche, Bergson, the absolute idealists of Bradley and Bosanquet and so on, Russell, Whitehead, Wittgenstein, Freud, psychoanalysis, Sartre, existentialism, deconstructionism, and so on and so forth. They eventually must be included within the process. The contradiction of a philosophy has only the meaning that the limit, Schranke, Grenze is the limit, and Schranke is, I don't know if there are two words, border in a way, but we'll use the word Schranke as difference from Grenze, limit. The Schranke is, the limit in a way is transcended, and the determined bestimmte Prinzip, the determined principle of this philosophical system is incorporated as an ideellen Moment, as an not ideal but ideal moment within the new system. And he says that the various thinkers of the history of philosophy, they are like a pantheon, which literally means all the gods, of Göttergestalten, of divine figures. Diese Göttergestalten, these various divine figures, are verschiedenen Stufen, are distinct stages, moments, degrees, levels of the idea, which develop themselves in a dialectical fashion, one after the other. Yeah. So the beginning of logic is the same as the beginning of the actual history of philosophy. This beginning, we find this in the Eleatician, the Eleats, and more precisely in the philosophy of Parmenides, which expressed and grasped the absolute as being by saying, das Sein nur ist und das Nichts ist nicht. Being is and non-being or nothing is not. And this is to be considered as the proper beginning of philosophy, because philosophy in general is thinking cognition, thinking knowledge, denkendes Erkennen. And here the pure thought, das reine Denken, the pure thought must be kept, firmed, grasped, fixed, festgehalten, and make itself objective to itself. So thought, thinking, has to grasp itself. Thought has to conceptualize itself in a way. And then he says, gedacht haben wir zwar die Menschen von Anfang an, denn nur durch das Denken unterscheiden sie sich von den Tieren. That's a Hegelian motto. The difference between men and animals is thought. But Darwin says there are intelligent animals, and obviously there are humans who do not think, those who can't, the babies and the degenerate, either because of the degeneracy of the brain or because of some degenerative cognitive process. But in the view of Hegel, thought is the essential feature of humans, because there might be intelligent and smart animals like dolphins, dogs, monkeys. Animals can learn. I've learned that animals can make jokes, apparently. Darwin, in The Descent of Man, says that there are animals who can make jokes. They have feelings, they can learn, they can become smarter, they can speak in a way like parrots, but no animal except the human animal has ever said, and maybe will ever say, I am. No monkey, except the human monkey, the human ape, ever said, I am. Yeah. The Eleates are famous for being profound thinkers. So they have recognized pure being as the truth. Truth is being, pure being, and they had brought to our consciousness and representation this truth. And then Hegel says, but das wahre Verhältnis, the real relationship, is, however, that das Sein, being, pure being, as such, is not fixed, and is not the fixed and the last, ein festes und letztes, but rather, as dialectical, it's the passage in its opposite, entgegengesetztes, namely into nothing, which is also immediate. And I will end the video here, and I will make a second video about nothing, because what is dialectics? At the root, at the beginning, pure being, one could say it's the only truth. There is only pure being. But the problem, so to speak, the dialectical twist, is that pure being, because there is nothing in pure being, but to say in means a spatial determination, because pure being is nothing, so it's the opposite of itself. And this I don't know how to express it. What's this problem, or this mystery, this subtlety, this I don't know what word to use. The fact that being and nothing are identical, because in both they are immediate absence of any determination, but at the same time they are different. And this unity of difference, I will talk in the second video. That's what I could say about being, pure being, in broadly 58 minutes. So yeah, I will end by a joke. In my next video, I will talk about nothing. I will talk about nothing. And somehow, I might talk for a long time about nothing, because there's a lot of things to say about nothing. It seems to be an empty topic of discussion, but actually there are many things to say about nothing. Maybe someday some Buddhists will watch this video and they will laugh, and maybe it will give comfort to myself, that maybe I have been able to bring joy and laughter, at least to the Buddhist. Yeah.